What's up? Today we're going to talk about the First World War a little bit. Somebody said, here's an idea for history, talk about the events leading up to First World War and some of the major battles. I'm not going to discuss some of the major battles. Why? Because I'm frankly not that knowledgeable in them. I could answer a lot of those questions about the Second World War, but the First World War, a lot of details about the battles, I don't know. I haven't memorized the dates, the times. I know information off and on, but that I'm not incredibly knowledgeable, so I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not. The first thing I would really recommend, if you want to know more about the First World War, which I think everyone should, is to watch an excellent documentary that they sometimes show on the military channel called The First World War. It's fairly lengthy, and it's one of the only good documentaries on the First World War. It's a very overlooked event. You can see they show this shit on military channel. You can also find it online. Somebody's got it on YouTube somewhere. Just type in military channel First World War. You should come across it. Watch that, all right? And it'll tell you a lot of stuff. World War I is extremely important to understand. Besides just the curiosity and interest in the specific events, but it's mainly important to understand for three reasons, I think. The first one is what sort of why did it start, and learn what sort of events perpetuate this sort of conflict. What sort of activities bring something like this about. That's important. The second thing is, what's the result of technology that's advanced beyond understanding and tactics? That's a large reason for the immobility and the huge casualties in that war, was technology without the understanding to implement it properly, and without the understanding of how to get around it, the tactics and strategies to utilize and avoid these technologies. That's important. And the last thing is, not only how did the First World War lead to the Second World War, but how do policies similar to the ones enacted after the First World War lead to future conflicts, resentment, so on and so forth. The first thing is, what started this? Well, the popular, the exact event that triggered the war was the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand of Austria. That was the singular event that caused this to happen, but that was really just the spark. World War I was going to happen one way or another, just because of what went on in the century preceding it. Europe in the 1800s, especially the late 1800s, was a clusterfuck. We have a lot of wars, we have a lot of different countries, we have changing alliances and changing borders, new countries, new powers springing up seemingly all the time, and the balance of power is shifting back and forth and back and forth. And we have quite a thing going on here. I'm trying to find the exact name of something right here. It's not important. One of the most important wars to understand in order to understand the First World War is conflicts that went on in the 1870s between Germany and France, and the back and forth of territory, and the resentment that this left. What you had at the early 1800s was a total fucking up of the balance of power in Europe. The Napoleonic Wars and Napoleon's conquering of almost everybody really changed shit around, and left, once he was defeated, that left a big power vacuum. Now, who is going to fill that place? We have Austria-Hungary. the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which was at that time one country, and a much bigger country than Austria currently is. If you were to look at a map of that time, it spans a lot of Central and Eastern Europe. We have what was later to become the German Empire, which was really just a consolidation of a bunch of separate German states. Germany was a bunch of little countries, and these came together to form the German Empire. You have England becoming not just a major European power, but throughout the 1800s becoming really the predominant world power. With it was the sun never set on the British Empire, and that's the way it was. And that created a lot of tensions, especially with the Germans who wanted to become the European power. The most important thing to see here is these entangling alliances. These alliances between Germany and Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, alliances between France, England, Russia, so on and so forth. And that's the main reason that this devolved what was really, a dispute between the Serbians and the Austrians turned it into the second most destructive conflict in human history. It was these alliances that was the problem. And this is why the founders speak about no entangling alliances, and that's why I support that idea, because you create a lot of fucking problems. Alright? So it's not as important to understand Archduke Ferdinand's assassination as it is to understand the alliances and what was going on in the 50 to 100 years preceding this war. Now, the second most important thing that I discussed to understand about the Second World War is how these advancements in technologies, coupled with old tactics, old ideas, lead to disaster. You have basically generals that are taught that were schooled in what was essentially Napoleonic warfare, and had been the school of thought and the school of war for the last 110 to 15 years. That is big armies, big set-piece battles, massed cavalry. It's, by the way, if you get nothing out of this video, the word is pronounced cavalry, not Calvary. It's cavalry. That just really pisses me off, because it doesn't piss me off that people that people pronounce it wrong, because it looks, you look at the word and you say, oh, Calvary. I did that myself the first time I ever saw it, but they get so indignant when you're like, dude, it's cavalry. They're like, no, it's just the way you pronounce it. It's like, no, you're changing the fucking word. It's not a matter of how you pronounce it. It's not tomato. It's cavalry. So if you get anything out of that, it's cavalry. And do not ever say Calvary to any military historian that you ever encounter in school or that you know. Don't say that, because that shit pisses them off. If you can pronounce it cavalry, they'll love you instantly. It doesn't matter if you know anything else. They will love you if you can pronounce that fucking word correctly. So anyway, you have generals trained in mass formations of men firing at each other, mass cavalry charges, flanking maneuvers, shit like that, which is the way you had to fight wars before. Okay, that was right for the 1800s. That was how war was fought. But the First World War was very different. You cannot charge people who have machine guns. You just can't do it. We have fast-firing machine guns. We have people with bolt-action rifles that are very accurate. And another thing that's very important that people overlook is the kind of artillery that we're talking about here. Most of the 1800s artillery was fixed. You had a cannon. It was a chunk. It was basically a big, long tube that you put a cannonball or whatever kind of projectile you're firing in it, and you shot it. But since it was a big rigid piece, it got off track, and you had to get somebody and you had to roll it back and get it right into the spot again. But before World War I, we started to develop guns, that recoiled. Okay, and they recoiled, they didn't fuck up their trajectory, so you can fire one after another. As quickly as you can load it, you can fire an aimed shot. And that's very important to understand. When you can put massed accurate artillery onto any sort of advancing forces, whether it be horses or men, you will decimate that attack. And that something as simple as that changes the entire way that war has to be fought. You can no longer survive charging an open field. But they didn't know that. That's what they thought they had to do. And that's why we have, 5 million dead, 5.5 million dead on the Allied side, and 4.5 million almost dead on the Central Powers, 12 million, almost 13 million wounded on the Allies, almost 8.5 million wounded on the Central Powers. You have 4 million missing in the Allies, and about 3.5 million missing in the Central Powers. That's how you get those kind of numbers, okay? And most of these were military deaths. The reason that the death toll was so big in World War II is because of strategic bombing and shit like that, and the way that the war worked, and so many civilians were involved, so many civilians died. I'm not going to say that civilians didn't die and suffer in the First World War, but the war didn't move as much, and there wasn't large-scale strategic bombing. You weren't ruining cities the way that we did in the Second World War. So these are mostly military deaths. So we have all these, basically, what are the precursors of current modern technology. You had airplanes, tanks, machine guns, all this shit. But it wasn't, the tactics hadn't been developed yet. So you're basically just throwing men at machine guns, which is insanity. Absolute insanity. And you would have artillery barrages. This is the thing, when I first learned about it, that really astonished me, and you really have to think about it. You have artillery barrages that would last for weeks. Literally weeks, with no end, constant firing of shells, and you would just leave the landscape in ruins. It was unrecognizable. If it rained, it would just be a big mud pit with big fucking craters in it and shit. And then you would send men across this terrain, this ruined terrain, filled with craters and mud and mines and barbed wire, and charge them at people with machine guns. What the fuck are you going to think is going to happen? But they didn't know any better. And the weird thing is that things would be developed a little bit at a time. The Germans first got gas, but they really didn't take advantage of poison gas the way that they could have. They could have forced a breakthrough with the use of poison gas, but they didn't do it. They kind of used it to piss the British and the French off, and then the British and the French got their own gas, and they used it to kind of piss the Germans off, and nobody got anywhere. They just tortured each other for years. And you can't advance. I mean, consider this situation. You and 50 of your buddies are going over the trench, and you're running to try to get to the other trench, and on the way there, you lose 30 of your buddies, so there's 20 of you, and you get into the trench, and you take the trench. But now there's a counterattack. You only got 20 of your buddies. Some of them are probably wounded. You can't hold the trench, so you get forced back. That's why no one went anywhere, because so many people died on the way there. We're talking about you couldn't collect the bodies, because if you tried to get over the trench, you'd be shot. So you had corpses, thousands of them, laying between the trenches in the hot sun and the wet, with rats and bugs and shit eating on them. The stench is overwhelming. You have bodies in the trenches. You're using corpses to shore up the walls of your trench. In some places in Europe, the water table is so high that you dig a 6-foot trench and you have water in the trench, so it's constantly muddy, and there's all this disease, and people are getting sick. You have trench foot. You have to get their feet fucking amputated. People got dysentery. All kinds of fucked up diseases. Big ass rats are coming and chewing on your flesh while you're still alive. All kinds of crazy shit. And it wasn't very comfortable, and you weren't getting anywhere. And so many people died. We have, of course, the advent of airplanes in war, which were originally used for reconnaissance, which would be the logical way. They used to use balloons. You'd send up big hot air or helium balloons with a dude in a basket, and you'd use that for reconnaissance. But then they started to use planes, and then the planes would fly by each other, and one day somebody brought a pistol with him and started shooting at the other guy in the plane. Then the other guy brought a machine gun or whatever. Then you put machine guns on the planes, and then one day somebody decided, hey, I can drop grenades out of the planes. And they started dropping bombs and so on and so forth. So one of the only things that really resembled modern tactics in that war was the air battles. You had heavy bombers, though heavy for the time wouldn't be considered heavy now, or even by World War II standards. But you have heavy bombers, heavy strategic bombers, fighter escorts, fighter reconnaissance, strafers, ground attack fighters and shit like that. That was one area where the technology and the tactics met perfectly, because the tactics didn't exist yet. There were no tactics for aerial warfare, so they developed that as to what was prudent. One of the most important things that changed that war was, of course, tanks. But just like gas, tanks weren't originally used properly. They'd send 1 or 2 or 3 tanks, and at first it freaked everybody out. But after that, they learned that they could deal with 1 or 2 or 3 tanks. And these tanks are so, frankly, shitty. They'd break down. They couldn't go very fast. So you'd have 2 or 3 tanks. You send them on an attack. 2 of them would break down before they get there. The other one get fucked up by artillery, because the tanks can't carry really heavy guns. We're talking about 35 millimeter cannons at the most. Most of them just carry machine guns. It wasn't until they started to use tanks as cavalry in the same role that we saw breakthroughs. You have to use massed tank attacks, and that was a tactic that was developed then. A lot of it was developed by somebody, Patton, which you should all be familiar with. That's why they don't do it in America as much, but especially in England, their tank units are called cavalry divisions instead of armored divisions. So, that just shows the kind of disasters you can have when people aren't adjusted to the technology. And that's part of the reason that the French lost World War II so quickly. The French didn't win. I'm sorry. You got a part of Germany to administer after the war, but you guys didn't win shit. Not to say that some French didn't resist nobly, but France as an entity failed epically in that war because they treated the Second World War like the First World War. They built, you got the Maginot Line, you got big fixed defenses and shit, and they didn't think anyone could go around them. And Germans used new tactics that was consistent with the technology that they had, and they developed the tactics around the technology and kicked the shit out of the French. So that's just another example of that going on. And the third most important thing to understand about the First World War is how what happened after the First World War influenced the Second World War, and how similar policies influence the world today. You have, for instance, the Treaty of Versailles caused the Second World War. Flat out. I believe that 100%. Adolf Hitler would have never risen to power if the Germans had been given a more fair peace at the end of that war. It never would have happened. Sure, there would have been anti-Semitism, but nobody could have ever used that as an excuse to start a world war and kill 6 or 7 million people. The things inflicted on the German nation after World War I were completely unfounded and unfair, I believe 100%. I do not consider the Germans the aggressor in that war. I consider everyone the aggressor in that war because there was these fixed alliances. They didn't fucking do that. They shouldn't have been. They were basically blamed for the war, which is outrageous, I believe. And you have these ridiculous, they wanted them to pay for the war. How the fuck are you going to do that? The one thing that I will say that I think Hitler had a legitimate point on is that the Germans did not have to lose the war that way. Could the Germans have won World War II or World War I? No, they weren't going to take Paris. It wasn't going to happen, especially when the Americans came into the situation. There was just too much to fuck with. But they weren't going to lose the war either. The Allies weren't going to push towards Berlin. It wasn't going to happen. The Germans could have gotten an even peace, given up the territory they'd conquered and kept everything that they had before. They could have done that, but people at home were tired of the war, and they didn't understand the consequences of complete and total surrender. And the consequences of complete and total surrender was the raping of the German state by Allied powers. And you can see how this sort of thing creates resentment in other parts of the world. Why do you think North Korea hates us so much? Why do you think Saddam Hussein hated us so much? So we can place all these embargoes and shit on them. It pisses people off. And it's not always necessarily fair. Could it be considered fair in the case of Saddam Hussein? Was he the aggressor? Sure. But that's a different topic for a different time. So it's important to understand the kind of effects. They didn't think about it, It was the war to end all wars. People were fucking naive. And frankly, that didn't carry over into the end of the Second World War. People weren't so stupid as to think, oh, war is over now. But they didn't know any better at the end of the First World War. If you want to talk about America's involvement in the First World War, I think there's several misconceptions. A, it was not the sinking of the Lusitania. That is bullshit, simpleton thinking that is thrown at the masses about why that war happened. People who don't know anything about history are the people who say that. The Lusitania was sank in 1915, and we didn't go to war until April of 1917, okay? It wasn't the reason why we did it. If you cling on to the idea that that's the reason why we went to war with the Germans, you get a whole different idea of what the war was. Excuse me, because if you think, oh, it's the sinking of Lusitania, what you have in your mind is the Germans were going around sinking American cruise ships all the time or whatever. It wasn't really an American cruise ship, but and you have in your mind that Germans were these kind of evil murderers that were sinking civilian ships all the time. That wasn't what happened. The official reason for entry into World War I for the Americans was that the Germans were attacking neutral shipping. But my argument would be that we weren't neutral shipping. Under the rules of war, if you are a neutral country, let's say, for example, France and England or whatever are having a war, and the United States is officially neutral. Now, if the United States wants to continue shipping product to both these countries, they have to ship them equally. So if I'm going to sell one rifle to the British, I have to sell one rifle to the French. If I'm going to sell 5 tanks to the French, I have to sell 5 tanks to the British. And if one country is impeding that shipment, they are breaking the rules of war. And that's actually what the English did. They were impeding neutral shipping to Germany, which was a violation of neutrality. And I think that the Germans were 100% justified in sinking our shipping, because we were shipping disproportionately to the English, British, whatever. I think they were completely 100% fucking justified. But the main reason that I think we got involved in that war was, A, the people wanted it, B, we really wanted to help England, because we had a big heart-on for them, and C, we knew at the time, even at the time, that whoever won this war would potentially, or whatever group of people won this war, would potentially be the leaders of the world. They would be the foremost nations in world power. And that's why I think we got involved. And, really, it turned out the wrong way for us, because we went into this whole isolationism after that. But yeah, it is definitely worth it to learn a lot about the First World War. There's a lot of interesting things here. A lot of things that people don't talk about. And it was different wherever you were. The fighting in Africa was different than the fighting in France, and the fighting in France was different than the fighting in Russia. There was even fighting in India, and the Ottoman Empire, which today is Turkey, Greece, all different places. It really was a world war. You had naval conflicts between British and German ships in South America, in the Pacific. In the Atlantic Ocean, over especially beef shipments from Argentina. So it really was a world war. And it's a shame, a lot of people feel that there's a World War II overkill. There's all these specials about interviews with World War II veterans. I think that's really the wrong way to look at it, because these people aren't going to be around much longer. My grandfather was in World War II. Grandpa, how the fuck old? He's like 86. He's not going to be alive that much longer. You've got to learn shit from these people. And I don't think we really took advantage of that with World War I veterans. There's only one confirmed American veteran still alive, and he's 108. I believe all the German veterans died a couple of years ago. I think the last British veteran died recently, and I believe that the last Canadian veteran just died. So, World War II veterans aren't going to be around forever. We need to take what we can from them. And I hope that they do the same thing with Korean War veterans in Vietnam and eventually Iraq and all that shit. You can't pass up that opportunity. Also, another example, one more important thing to understand about World War I is it's how that created the Soviet Union. The Russians got knocked the fuck out by the Germans. The Russians were ruined. They sucked huge cock. I just have to be frank about it. They lost that war hard with the Germans in World War I. And that embarrassment over that defeat really helped create the Russian Revolution and what the lower classes in Russia considered their betrayal and their use by the aristocrats in Russia. So that's a brief little discussion. Like I said, you should watch a documentary called The First World War. It's oftentimes on the military channel, but you can find it on YouTube. I believe the dude has all the parts. You could also probably find it on some other websites online. Learn more about it. Don't skip it. Especially if you're not going to college for history or anything, you got to learn this kind of shit on your own, and it's important because they won't teach you this kind of shit in school because they don't consider it important, which I think is a shame. You have to take it upon yourself to expand your own knowledge because people aren't going to do it for you. So that's my little discussion. I'll see you folks later.